Hello and welcome. We are really looking forward to our panel today and want to join our audience joining us here live in Glasgow as well as around the world. We really have a very stimulating and qualified panel to discuss our topic today, which is how do we really think about mobilizing private markets in the transition to net zero? What quality governance is really required to make sure that we can scale effective and ethical carbon markets? Equally important, what difference do they make on the ground? How do you actually deliver tangible solutions? And I'm really, really pleased to be at one of the launch and acceleration events for the governance, as well as have a broad, diverse panel to talk about what concrete progress looks like. We want good governance, but when it's in place, how do we really make sure that we've got concrete, effective projects towards net zero in the wide range of environments, be they indigenous and developing economies, more developed economies that are still behind on the journey to net zero, or of course, those economies that have the ability, resources, and technologies to innovate and be right out front. It should be a really, really stimulating discussion, and thank you so much for joining us. The panelists that we have this morning will include a range of colleagues who are both helping to form the governance board as well as participating in it and its advisory councils going forward. There could be no more qualified group. We've agreed to let the panelists introduce themselves, and I'll start with Bill Winters.
Well, thanks, Vivian. It's great to be here. So, Bill Winters, I'm the chief executive of Standard Chartered Bank, but I was also the chairman of the task force on scaling voluntary carbon markets, which we set up about a year and a half ago. I will hopefully carry on with this effort from the position of a senior advisory council that the task force, now the Integrity Council for the Voluntary Carbon Markets, will establish. Hugh and Annette, as you saw in the video, are the co-chairs of the board. So the board is a governing board. They will ultimately be responsible for curating the core carbon principles and for making sure that the charter and ambitions of what was a task force, which is now a properly stood up governing body, are in place. They'll be advised by a senior advisory council, and they will also be advised by a formally constituted expert panel with 4 co-chairs who make up the subject matter expertise in the specific areas around the carbon markets and climate issues more broadly. So my pleasure to be here with the rest of the panelists today.
Fantastic. Thank you, Bill.
Hello, I'm Claire O'Neill. Mark Carney and I had a great idea back when we were thinking about where were the real action imperatives we could put in place for COP26. I was the minister responsible for COP at the time, and we thought that one of the things we really needed to do was to really drive forward this question of market development in the highest possible quality way. We needed to have ambition, we needed to have assurances, and we needed to have action. And it was incredible to see from those small conversations this incredibly powerful task force develop. I now represent the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. We've been closely involved in the structuring of the work. We co-chair the Natural Climate Solutions Alliance, and through the Alliance and through the WBCSD we will continue to have a role with the task force going forward through the governance structure.
Thank you.
Hello, my name is Sanjayan. I'm the CEO of Conservation International. We're an organization that works essentially in the global south, in about 30 countries directly and indirectly in about 50 countries around the world. We are based on a very simple premise that people need nature to thrive. So we protect and restore nature for people. We've been involved in the carbon markets for many years now, and it feels like this is something we've been waiting for, this moment, for a very, very long time. Augustin Silvani, who runs our Conservation Finance Division, has the pleasure of being on the board of this task force.
Thank you, Sanjay. Hindou.
I'm so happy to be with all of you here today also to talk about this important topic, how we can go to the net zero. That's from my side. So I'm coming from indigenous communities, who is a border pastoralist, and I'm here to represent also the rest of my brothers and sisters, indigenous peoples, who are the first concern when we talk about the nature, when we talk about the forest, when we talk about what will be the carbon that can lead us to the net zero very soon. I cannot say 2050. So I have been invited to the council, but just invited for now.
Thank you. And my name is Dame Vivian Hunt. I will moderate the panel today as we talk about how do we think about carbon markets helping to deliver tangible solutions. The first part of that architecture is good governance. And so, Bill, as we come back to that launch and sort of the formal launch of the governance panel here at COP, why is having that in place first so important?
When we set up the task force, it started as a task force. Now it's a proper governing body. It's like properly constituted. So I should stop referring to it as a task force. But when we set up the task force, the idea was to, number one, establish standards for high integrity in the voluntary carbon markets. We know what has hindered the development of voluntary carbon markets. It's been uneven standards.
Yep.
There were some excellent deals. Conservation International is a role model for excellent transactions and projects. And there were deals that were either less well thought out or less well enacted or less well enforced. Undermine the confidence of the whole market. Everybody pays the price. So number one, first step, got to get the integrity right with a common set of standards, common across the market, ideally common globally. Number two, though, was then to not have that be a static exercise, but to continually curate and oversee those standards to make sure that they're always of the highest standards and evolving with our understanding of science, with the experience that we gain. So having an independent governing body that can oversee those standards was critical, and that's what we've come up with. So as I mentioned, there's a board of directors, 22 members, from across a broad cross section of the carbon value chain, as it were. The majority of the board of directors is people that have been defined as independent, and independent are people that have no economic interest in the underlying market. Everyone's there representing the planet. No one's there representing their organization. But we've got good representation of people who have the perspective of the Global South, the perspective of the NGO community, the academic community, Indigenous people, and market participants. So there are, of a 22-person board, there are 3 market participants. There will be 3 people who are coming from Indigenous local communities. And the rest are largely NGOs, some of whom, like CI, are involved in originating projects, some of whom are not, and academics. Right? That's the board. That's ultimately the decision-making body for curating these core carbon principles. They'll be advised by 2 other bodies. One is a group of expert panels. We've got 4 co-chairs of the expert panel committee. These are world-class experts in carbon markets and emission mitigation, with an operating staff, and then the ability and the budget to pull in technical expertise as needed for particular thorny issues. We know there are thorny issues. Second is this Senior Advisory Council, of which I hope to be a member. Mark Carney, Nick Stern, and Hindou, we hope will be a member, and maybe Sanjay as well, if we get there. And that's the idea. There is to have a group of people that probably a little bit less time intensive, bringing as broad a perspective as possible from as diverse a background as possible. So you've got a very strong technical panel, hopefully a very strong advisory council advising this board on how to curate these core carbon principles.
And in some ways, hardwiring some of the things that have gone well with effective task forces, which is the right technical and content expertise, the time and analytics to be able to come up with the range of answers, and then input from stakeholders, but building that into the structure of the governance right from the off. Sanjay, maybe you can come and talk a little bit about, as a participant on the governance board, what success would look like from your perspective.
Well, first and foremost, let me say I completely agree with the way Bill has laid out this. We've waited for this for a long time. In the absence of this, of these guardrails, if you will, there's been great projects, there's been okay projects, and then there's been a basket of things that aren't really something that any of us would really see as a genuine project. And so it's really important that this gets going now. If you're wondering why there's probably so many layers to why is it you have a board, you have advisory boards, you have technical panels, et cetera, it's because it is complex.
Absolutely.
This is not actually that easy to do. In principles, it's very simple, but actually to make a good carbon project work on the ground in a faraway place like the coast of Liberia or Kenya or Colombia is quite challenging. Now, if we get this right, and it's my entire intention to get this right, this will be the greatest flow of capital that I can imagine from the G7, the G20, to places that we have worked our entire lives in and that are desperate for funding and financing so that people can make a living, they can protect what is ultimately their land. So what would really great look like? clear principles, high standards, and then a continual ratcheting up so that it's not static, it just keeps getting better and better and better. We should not be giving free pass to people who are using anything like this for greenwashing. We should hold companies that participate in this market to high standards, and then we should make sure that benefits flow to communities, that communities who are on the front lines of conservation are participating in it through their own free, prior, informed consent. It's their projects, they choose, they get to decide whether to participate or not, and we need to be absolutely honest brokers in that process.
And we were speaking earlier, Claire, about the importance of confidence, confidence in governments that what they are endorsing, funding, creating the market structures for which private and public funds can combine, the importance of confidence and credibility there. And I just don't know if you wanted to just reflect on that.
Yeah, well, I think one of the reasons for being so passionate about this is that, to exactly Sanjay's point, that we talk a lot about a just transition, and we talk a lot about the need to finance nature. And I've heard Hindou speak so powerfully about the role of Indigenous populations in being the stewards of those funds when we're actually restoring nature, protecting nature. What I found so strange, I think, in some of the phrasing or some of the conversations around the task force is I was the UK minister responsible for billions of pounds of development funding, including that was flowing through RED projects and elsewhere, to these sorts of areas. And frankly, we had to stop funding some of those projects because we could not have an assurance that the governance structure on the ground was appropriate to deliver the results we needed. And I've always slightly, if I could be brutally honest, wondered why we are so prepared to trust politicians at a national or a regional or a local level. This is, we somehow have a sort of binary thing that somehow all governments are going to do absolutely the right thing in the fullest transparency, and that all businesses are going to do quite the opposite. And I think this is a very, very dangerous and false construct. And of course, the other thing that happens is we say that philanthropic money is fine, and we trust philanthropy to get involved. Philanthropy is simply often, in many cases, an accumulated pool of extreme wealth that has come from the private sector. So I'm slightly impatient now with a lot of the academic arguments and framing that go into this. It's quite clear to unlock these pools of capital, we need well-functioning intergovernmental markets and well-functioning private markets, just as we have in the debt market, where essentially whether it's a gilt or it's a corporate debt instrument, they are trading in the same glare of transparency. And I think one of the things that this task force I have observed has been so careful to do is to develop an assurance around governance that frankly could be the envy of many of these intergovernmental projects that we also want to see funding. And I've seen the task force role in many cases as acting as a lighthouse to deal with the tricky issues of governance, assurance, inventory, creation of core carbon credits, creation of contracts. This is all really great, and what I'd like to see is the continued involvement of this, and I think this very careful structuring of the governance board with the expert advisors is something that we should really welcome and really celebrate.
And really, in the end, give all of us confidence that there's an objective rigor to how they're set up so that it can be useful and actually accomplish the goals that we've laid out, and really need to deliver for the planet as well as for productivity. The productivity and impact is going to be seen in concrete projects, as you mentioned, Sanjay. And Hindou, I wanted to come to you next to talk about what this really means on the ground. Let's assume for a moment that the hope for the standard of a governance process that's of the quality that we are launching and accelerating today does happen. How do you see it helping projects on the ground in the communities which you represent?
So I think when we talk all this discussion, so we need to keep them in the level down to the communities. And most of the time what's happening when we talk about climate, biodiversity and all, so the decisions are coming from the top, going to the community down. But no, the communities, and especially the indigenous communities, we all recognize we protect 80% of the world's biodiversity. When we protect it, we do it in our land, in our territories. So those resources are on the ground for those communities. So how the governance structure can change the way of operating from top to down, but go from the down to top. and how the communities can see the best way of this governance. Of course, we know that when climate change impacts the forests, the indigenous peoples are the frontline one.
Yeah.
So that's why we wanted to give this response from now to 2050 in order to get to net zero. So to give this response to people to get adapt, to get mitigate and all, so they must be involved. Yes, it's good to have 3 people in the board, but if you have protect 80% of the world's resources, so maybe it's time to think about more. Because when we say 3, is it the 3 from just 3 bigger forests like Asia, Africa, and Latin America? But no, the carbon is stored. It's also in the land. It's also in the oceans. So how about the rest 7 regions of the indigenous peoples? So like personally, I think how to make it work, we need all the 7 regions where they can have the carbon participating, because they can give a good guidance to this board. And of course, when we come back to the council, so how the council can look at the funding flowing that, Sanjayan talked about it. So we wanted to get it in a highway, who can go straight to the communities, not passing through the filters, and at the end, community do not receive it. So to community receive it, we need to change this system of access to the funding. So the funding must adapt to the need of the peoples, not the peoples who have to adapt to the funding design. So also coming back to peoples on the ground need to be participating in the design of this funding.
And you could imagine a world where the governance bodies actually advise on how government and projects are set up so that the stakeholder engagement is reflected. It may not be realistic to have every voice. It's about the difference between representative diversity versus experiential diversity, neurodiversity. It may also be in the guidelines that the governing body requires, the financing guidance, the representation and input guidance may be another way in which you can make sure the right voices by project, by initiative are reflected.
Yeah, so when we talk about the guidance, I think we need guidance and tools, because most of the time that people talk about the capacity building in order to have the communities endorse or better benefit. But no, it is the time of doing the tools also in the opposite side. Capacity building to those who are designing the thing, taking the decisions, because the way how the forests work, how the ocean work, indigenous communities on the ground know it better. Exactly. So it is the time that they build the capacity of those who are doing this market, or those who are having the companies or the big organization or government even. So they must learn of how we are doing the things, and then that can help them to set up the legislation that can work correctly with an exact timeline. 2050, no discussions, net zero for everyone.
Maybe, Sanjay, and then I'll come back to you, Hindou. I would love to hear just an example of what you think good or excellent looks like, particularly in the context of these more fragile communities.
Sure.
The most fragile communities.
And I want to support something Hindou said, because I think, as I'm sitting here thinking, in the future, we could ask for this. I think there is some merit to considering having regional groups that are advisory groups that are more representative, and you could break it by continent, you could break it by habitat type, so you can have an oceans group, a forest group. There's no reason why we couldn't increase both representation but also increase the expertise, as these things are quite different. Doing a blue carbon project on the coast of Colombia is quite different from doing a project in Kenya. So let me give you an example of what I think is a high quality project. I'm trying to convince Hindou to come down and see this with me in a month or so. And any of you are welcome to join it. So the Chulu Hills of Kenya are amazing, right? The Green Hills of Africa are quite fabled. They're sort of in between sort of Amboseli and Tsavo National Parks, and they provide the headwater for the river that flows into Mombasa, the second biggest city in Kenya. And the Maasai communities, mostly a Maasai community, pastoral community, have been stewards and guardians of the place for a very long time. A small part of it is actually sort of a national park. The vast landscape around it is actually in community holding. Now, some years ago, some of them started setting up ecotourism enterprises, lodges, high-end, people come in, a benefit flows to the community. Some of them are sort of owned by and operated by the community. And they approached us, and they started a long conversation with us, first about water. But then they started talking about carbon. Like, we are told that there is value in these hills. We think there's value in these hills. This is where we take our cattle in the dry season and cut trees down to feed them. But, you know, is there something more here? And as they started hearing about it, we work with Wildlife Works on the ground and some wonderful team members who really created or helped create this carbon project for the Chulus. Now, I'll tell you why this project is such a shining example. So last year, tourism in that part of the world went to zero, like absolutely zero. There was no foreigners coming in there, which are the high-paying tourists. And those communities, every single one of them, was in desperate straits because the income that they come to depend on from the lodges, from the employment of the lodges, went to zero. And you can go to those communities and they will tell you the saving grace was carbon.
Right.
The saving grace was carbon. So for me, you know, for all the detractors of projects, and I'm not trying to defend projects that are not well designed, you know, I wouldn't know what to tell Samson on the Maasai community or the Maasai Wilderness Trust. I wouldn't know what to tell them if we had to sort of pull out of this. The companies that have bought into it, those companies were chosen by the community. So we presented it to them and said, which one do you want to go with? And they picked the companies that are ultimately now funding some of that work.
And I don't want to belabor the political point, but I think it's worth mentioning again, and this is not a universal statement, but time and time again we have governments, particularly in the global south, where the majority of their voters are living in urban environments. That is the development challenge, is to get water and electricity to your urban population. Why? Because they're most likely to turn out to vote in an election. And it is, you know, time and time again we will see this benign neglect or active, active challenges with Indigenous communities, particularly farming communities. And this is why I find, again, this binary distinction so incredibly damaging, because the opportunity to actually provide a contractually transparent, well-designed project that works with the expertise of the Indigenous communities and delivers carbon benefits through the carbon process is so incredibly powerful. And why do we think governments would do that better than the private sector? I think they, in many cases, would do it a lot worse. And again, this is why I've been so passionate about the desire to create the task force to solve the problems of quality. We know that this has been a credibility gap in this market, which we have to resolve. But we can deliver this, and we can get the money flowing, and we can get the community, and particularly the women, if I may. Has always been a huge issue for me, is the gender empowerment question. We can do this, and we just need to crack on.
Both on the importance of participation on the secure land rights, participation in investment of the projects, and long-term ownership, in addition to the asymmetrical impact on climate damage and health damage, you know, suffered particularly in the global south. Hindou, I'd love to hear an example of what good looks like, maybe from a different perspective or region. And then, Claire, I'll come back to you about what maybe there's some analogies in larger, more developed economies. But Hindou, first with you.
Yeah, I mean, I think the example that Sanjayan gave, it's a good examples. But how the good or successful project will look like. So I think the first setup is the right best approach. It has to be really the human right, because this is what is missing. And we are here in the COP26. You know, the negotiation in this Article 6 on the carbon market, taking delay from the COP23 to today. And why is taking delay? And many governments do not want to have the right best approach. And some of them do not want to have the participation of the communities. And some of them are fighting to get the communities and to get the human right, Indigenous people right in. So there is these two blocks. But how the good project can make change the mind of those who do not understand the importance of the communities. So I think we need to build the case on the right best approach. And the best one to do it is the communities themselves. Because no one can come and build the case and tell the others it's working. So if the community themselves build how the rights are respected in this implementation, so then the negotiator must understand you cannot succeed without having community. You cannot succeed without respecting the right of the communities there. So you have to mention in all the decisions. This is also the fear of the Indigenous communities there when we are in the negotiation. And we see this division, we say like, well, is it any door to get out of this by respecting what we are doing? And the second thing is the consultation. because we cannot just decide who is going to be in, who cannot. It has to be in a consultative way, and consultation is not meaning information. So we need to set up a process to consult the communities, to get them in if they want or not, or how we wanted to change. So then people do not, speak French or English or Arabic or whatever. They speak their own mother tongue. They speak the language of the nature. So all this need to be combined to make the success a greater one. They need to see, in my community, I need to see how the life of my people change, how they get access to the water, to the pastures, how they can live in harmony with their communities, and of course, how they can construct the future. Because the future for us is not 2050, it is the 7 next generation. So just to count like 100 of years. So then that we can have all the success of the project will look like.
Can I just add something? So I completely agree with what Hindou said. So one of the big challenges we have when we go and do these carbon projects is to figure out whose land is it?
Yep.
And oftentimes it is the indigenous peoples who have either formally or informally been using the land, but all of a sudden county government or national government or private sector will say, no, you can protect this and make a carbon project out of it. And then the pastoralists, for example, in the example I gave you, is like, wait a minute, we've been grazing our cattle on these hills for ever. In the case that I gave you of the Chulus, the truth is the beneficiaries are government, so Kenya Wildlife Service is there, there's some private ranches there, and there's also community. So they all had to actually come together and kind of come to an agreement. But in many places that doesn't happen. You just get the permission from government, you go ahead and develop the project, but then the people who've always been there blame, like, wait a minute, what the hell just happened to me? So there is some real challenge here, because the minute there's value that we can monetize, then someone is going to ask, well, whose is it to give away?
And I think the notion of having the right principles in the architecture, but being able to drive them down to the project plan level so that those consultations take place, that you can work through those issues and they have the markers so that if something does receive the endorsement, engagement, or cert, that it is consistent with those principles and aligned, that we know for sure that it's actually happening on the ground. And I like, the principle-based approaches sound very theoretical, but when you put them into action in a governance institution, they actually are the rule makers. And hopefully we'll have also the ability to highlight the good cases we've been discussing, but also the ones who are abusing the market or not wanting to be as transparent. So it's got effective governance cuts both ways, right? It both rewards and encourages, accelerates, gets capital to the projects that are the right structure and will work, build the capabilities, but also limit, highlight, name and shame, whatever language you want to use, the ones that aren't, so that those distractions of capital and destruction of communities stop as well. Claire, I want to shift, if we can, to the concept of developing economies, whether that's economic development economies that happen to be large at the moment, or ones that are more developed in terms of their understanding of the importance of the carbon markets and sophistication of instruments. Those things aren't necessarily correlated. We know that at COP26. I'd be interested in your perspective on how these principles around governance apply in your experience.
Thank you. Well, and again, I sort of slightly struggled. Are we talking developing economies, or are we talking the developed markets? And I chose, I suppose, to focus a bit on where this market is developing most quickly. And again, this is really being driven by a lot of large corporate involvement. And at the World Business Council, we work with the most ambitious, sustainable global companies who have to commit to join to be focused on exactly on net zero by 2050 at the latest, to be nature positive, and to be committed to reduction in human inequality, and all done in the highest possible transparency principles. So I think our members, as a proxy for that market, are focused on the co-benefit of solving for climate and nature and inequality. They are very big sources of demand, and we've seen through the Demand Accelerator program that we've put in with the NCS Alliance, we've seen really good demand commitments, but crucially done to the highest possible principles. And this was a big piece of work done with full consultations with the NGOs, project developers and the demand pools to say, and these were really painful conversations. I mean, we went over and over and over again, and they were legally important. They were sort of emotionally important in many ways, and I think we came up with what is a really good forward step. And that work, I know, has also been aligned with a lot of the work of the task force. So I think there's this great sense of demand, provision, and of course the other thing that we see with our members, and this is sadly not the case in all corporate sectors, is this desire to do this in an appropriate mitigation hierarchy. No one's trying to cheat their way to net zero using this. Our members are absolutely clear that there is a mitigation hierarchy, that in many cases this will end up being the solution for the hardest to abate sectors. By the way, that's not a time thing. You can do that now because we know the understanding of where those pools need to come from. But this is not trying to greenwash or cheat our way to net zero. And then I think the other thing that's going to be really interesting is in some of the developed markets, thinking now from an economic point of view, how we can link those well-founded emissions trading schemes to the provision of additional funding for natural climate solutions, whether again it's in a domestic setting or in an international setting. And that work hasn't gone nearly far enough yet. And there are reasons for that. But I think that sense of, here is an automatic source of capital. You can think then about creative things like top slicing that for adaptation. This is something I think I've proposed to the task force. If we're serious about adaptation funding, we can start to top slice some of these funding flows so we can get creative. But it feels like, as we started saying, Vivian, that we have this momentum that's happening. We know that we've seen credibility gaps before. I think the worst possible signal we could send to the world is to somehow stop. And to basically down tools and say, we've all worked so hard on this for the last few years. We've problem solved at the absolute frontier. Clearly there are different places where we still need to work. But to suddenly down tools, imagine what credibility signal that sends to the people to whom we have made so many promises over the years, to the market participants we want to emerge, and frankly to those who have a real vested interest in making this work. So I think that sense again of where it's not perfect. We need to go further and faster. The developed markets can help, and there are plenty of things we don't know, but we have to keep building on this momentum.
And I really like the examples not only of the guidelines and principles, the transparency and downside boundary conditions, penalties perhaps, for ensuring that there's not bad behavior, but also I think you've brought into the discussion this concept of positive incentives. How can we actually maximize the technologies, approaches, markets that we know can work effectively now and get more capital
and again, I've
focus
always
on applied to that.
And we've always gone back to this idea of, okay, if we're talking about market creation, again, the debt market, whether it is a gilt and you have a rating on that, and also you can have then, we talked about the pricing curve. So if I want to be investing in a project that is directing funding to women's groups in an Indigenous community, for long-term stewardship, then I want to know that, and I ought to want to pay for that and have verification that it's happening. And you can't do that now. This is a very, very difficult thing. And also you end up with, everything just being too cheap in this world. This is the other challenge, that the natural climate solutions are far too cheap. The money is not flowing.
So, Bill, coming back to you, you've co-signed an open letter alongside Mark Carney, Nick Stern, and a number of other leading CEOs to, in some ways, further illustrate how serious business is and big capital is about, investing permanently in a well-structured market and much better outcomes for the planet, the economy, and people who are disproportionately affected. Can you say more about how that call to action, call to market creation is working real time?
Yeah, but we've referred to this as a high ambition statement that corporations should make. And I think very few people will not have a net zero transition plan with material progress by 2030. 50% is the benchmark. But that still leaves a lot of carbon going into the environment every day, starting from today. And a high ambition corporation, in our opinion, to qualify as net zero should be compensating for that carbon emission along the way. So the pathway to net zero is fundamentally about changing your business model to migrate from a high carbon business model to a lower carbon business model. In some cases, all the way to zero. In some cases, there will be some very, very difficult or impossible to abate sectors. And offsets will have a role to play in mopping up the remainder of that pathway to net zero. The compensation, though, is actually a material amount of money to reduce a material amount of carbon from the environment by corporations like Standard Chartered Bank, which I run, saying we're going to buy offsets or take other steps, but offsets are the most direct way to transfer money from my bank, my shareholders, to Sanjay and people like that, who through a market, transparent, help set a carbon price, help get the offset projects in place right now in an accelerated way. Now, if every corporation adopts a high ambition statement, the likelihood that we get to net zero by 2050 increases dramatically. If we don't, in theory, the science-based targets get us to net zero by 2050. But the idea that there might not be any slippage along the way, or that there will be complete or perfect compliance along the way, it's very unlikely. We know that.
Yep. And I want to stress that it's the point is that it's the high ambition, the stretching targets, the commitment to work with experts, expertise, to understand how it's good for your shareholders, good for your other stakeholders, employees, the communities which you serve, the partners that you may have, and still really productive and sustainable. It's not necessarily that offsets, which is the one example that you gave as a bridging solution, is the primary solution. That actually may just buy you some time in the transition.
Offsets cannot displace reduction. The pathway to net zero, articulated by science-based targets or other organizations that are basing their migration pathways on science, that has to happen. In addition, there's an opportunity to compensate for the emissions along the way. And let me just add, what will induce corporations to make this claim? Well, first and foremost, that they need to believe that's part of a responsible corporate operating procedure. Right? Number two is they have to have confidence that the offsets that they buy are going to be recognized by exactly the stakeholders that are asking corporations to be high ambition in the first place. So if the message to the corporate world is, we don't like offsets, and we think offsets are a form of greenwashing, and we want to make sure that you don't touch the offset market, well, then that money's not going to change hands. Sanjay's not going to get as much. He'd get the money anyway because you're super high quality, but not the community won't get as much as they should, and it dramatically reduces the likelihood that we actually get to net zero.
And can I just build on Bill's point briefly, because I agree, but I think that the IPCC report was absolutely clear that we also have to embrace carbon removal at scale, that this is a reduction pathway and it is a removals pathway. And again, this is something we haven't spent enough time collectively considering, partly because people see this as a moral hazard. It's not either or, it's both and. And again, the opportunity to channel funding for carbon removal to a carbon positive, carbon negative, nature positive, people positive outcome is absolutely huge. So again, we spend so much time sort of arguing about this, whereas actually we know only 8% of global financing is going to nature. We know that we are not getting development financing flowing, particularly into the areas where young women and girls can benefit. And again, we've just made perfect the enemy of the good in this whole conversation. And I just think we're out of time, actually, for a lot of these conversations. We're out of time.
Sorry, I think we all wanted to react on that. That's the questions, because for us, it's what is the difference between Red Plus, CDM, who maybe sometimes works for some communities and sometimes not, with this one. Because for this one, we don't have time.
We don't have to, exactly.
9 years is really nothing. And I don't want to see my community disappear because of inaction of some peoples. I don't want to see the forest of Amazon from where indigenous peoples are living for thousands of years, or the glacier melting or whatever. I don't want to see that. So what will be the difference that this one can take us as fast as possible to the net zero? So I think what we need to do now is having a clear roadmap by A plus B, how the people who are expert and non-expert can understand the plan of everyone on each that's going to reduce the emissions. It has to be set up not only from the private sectors, from the government also, the NDCs. All the addition need to take us to 1.5. So we have to see this clear roadmap, and this is missing. So this is the first point to start, and then we can come back to the governance and all the rest of the thing in order to accelerate. Otherwise, let me say that I really, and I think all indigenous communities will never forgive the world to destroy our peoples, to make us disappear from our islands. to our desert or Sahara. So we don't want to take them responsible. So that's also the reason we have to work all together.
I think this is a great point of concordance.
We're violently
amongst all
agreeing.
of us. like really,
Yeah.
like, you know, carbon offsets should not be a shortcut.
Yes.
They're an accelerator
Yeah.
to get to where Hindou
And-
wants to get to, and we all want to get to.
And the framework, the governance and the principles is not a substitute for the ambition and the specificity of plans. If you think about what it really takes for a corporation or a startup, right, to actually operate with these principles in mind in a transparency-based environment, it takes real effort. It takes time. You can't start it tomorrow. You've got to start it when the project's ready. You can't take money wherever you can get it from. You've actually got to vet and calibrate that and make sure it's viable instruments. You've got to make sure that your shareholders, same as your activists, same as your employees, actually buy in and understand that. Doesn't mean there won't be debate, some disagreement, or that we're going to have everything today. But it does mean that if you want that urgency and pace and scale of change with participation from the private sector, how can private markets and the carbon markets really accelerate this change? The plans have to be specific. And the presence of the private sector at COP26 in such a concrete and active way is a signal to me that there's a level of seriousness because they're committing to all their stakeholders,
Well,
not just
because
not just at
70%
COP.
of emissions come from the private sector. So it is an absolute conceit, I think. It's not only a conceit, it's just wrong to say that governments can and will regulate us to a net zero future. They can't, and in many cases they won't. And so this concept that, of course, this is a public-private partnership. Everything is the world is a public-private people partnership. And again, this is, and you know, there are lots of questions about, to your point, Vivian, that we have got the private sector here in unprecedented numbers. One of the things we don't have is a formal docking mechanism where the World Business Council published its manifesto. We'd like to see corporate determined contributions brought forward to COP every year, so there can't be the greenwashing and there can't be the, you know, oh, you just showed up and you made promises and you went away. No, but our businesses want to be at the table. We can have disclosure on carbon removal, on offsetting, and an absolute clarity again around these frameworks. But this idea that somehow the government is coming to save us globally, I'm afraid is wrong.
Well, and the government have their NDCs that set them in the tables, and we are telling them that you have to change. But we wanted to see also all the corporates set all the NDCs with clear plan, how they are going to do these just transitions. So this is the part who is missing. And if we don't have that, there will be no trust that can be built, and there will be no confidence that also can be built. So they need to set up this trust by showing the concrete example how they're going to do by 2030, by 2050, and make it transparent. I really love the word. Make it transparent to everyone in the screen.
And thankfully, that pressure is there. I mean, Standard Chartered Bank wrote a very detailed net zero transition plan, 2030, 2050, published publicly. Please read it and give us ideas on how to make it better. That was our invitation. It will be dynamic, probably dynamic in a tightening way rather than dynamic in a loosening way. But that's, every corporation is in the process of doing that. And whether that's made mandatory, which could be a government action, obviously we've heard that from the UK, or voluntary, so that the stakeholders of these corporations are compelling corporations to make these advances. That's critical. Let's take it a step further and adopt these high ambition principles so that we're actually compensating for emissions along the way. There's always going to be a primary focus on nature and indigenous and local people, local communities. But let's not forget the technology that can be part of this removal equation as well.
Yes,
carbon removal. Let's think about the offset market and how it can be adapted to a new world, a new set of use cases around the scaling of technologies that work but are uneconomic today. Right? So always protect nature. That's going to be the carbon sink that we have to protect is nature.
And enhance nature as well.
And enhance nature, but let's also think about how we can address the technology gap as well.
And the pragmatism of making the maximum use of the technologies that can already be applied today. I mean, Kanak's research about what could be done today is very powerful. New innovations, including the financial and capital markets, which is, I think, the big gear shift that we see at COP26. And finally, the accountability at project level that organizations like Conservation International, well, really all three and four of you represent across the different sectors. The panel was really put together to be able to represent the highest standards and some high standard examples from the public-private people partnership, conservation as well as global north and global south.
And not only technology, because I mean, peoples or companies seems to talk a lot about technology innovation, but nature is not need technology.
You're
nature
right.
need peoples, and the peoples have the traditional knowledge from the communities
You're right.
that we have for centuries and thousands of years. So you must put the traditional knowledge of indigenous peoples in the center. So the technology cannot plant a tree, it cannot change a way of
I've heard you made
how
this speech powerfully.
yeah,
so
how the birds can move.
We don't need
not the
drones.
insect.
We
So
can-
we
yeah,
need the
that's a
peoples
great
and
point.
their knowledge that can restore the nature. And the technology maybe can monitor the finance that you are having because that can be applied. So for the nature, let us do our job.
Well, and I don't think anyone underestimates the power of human capital, right, which is just another form of capital to change the world. I want to thank you all for joining us, and in particular Bill, Claire, Sanjay, and of course Hindou for joining us for this discussion. Hugh and Annette, we wish you all of the best luck in co-chairing this governance panel, setting the high integrity operating norms, getting input from the experts as well as market participants and stakeholders that are needed to really make sure that we all get it right this time and get to net zero in the highest quality way in the private, public, third sector, and at frontline communities across the world. Thank you for joining us.